Hey, welcome to EBMX. This is our setup of the X9000 on an MX4. I'm going to run through stock battery and 72 volt with the stock MX4 motor. So once you've got your controller installed, basically what you want to do is turn on your bike, open up your app, you want to click search. What you will see is a bike come up here. I've labeled this bike 1 just so I know what it is, but it'll come up as nothing for you, but you can label this later. So jumping into the app, if you do want to label your bike, basically come over to here and you can edit it here. So for instance, we'll call this MX4. That'll now save, so every time you go back into the Bluetooth, basically you'll see MX4 come up, and if you do have multiple bikes, you'll know that this is an MX4. So the first step is basically go into settings, and you want to go to your general. In here, you can select your battery type, and you select what your bike type is. So you've got a couple of options here. You've got Suron Ultrabeat, Talaria Sting, and other. We have a Talaria Sting here, we'll select that. Our motor, we know we have a Talaria Sting with an MX4 motor, so we'll select that. In this case, we have a 20S 72 volt battery installed in this bike, and we are running the stock harness. If you are with a stock battery, you'll select 16S EBMX stock harness. Your current limit for a stock harness and a stock MX4 battery will be 160 amps for both ratings and a total of 10.5 kilowatt. That'll give you a peak of 11.5 kilowatt when using this setup. We'll run through that afterwards. So I've just reverted back to what this bike is. It's a 20S, 72 volt, and I'm running an EBMX stock harness, or basically the bike stock harness is what we're referring to there. Our current limit is going to be 180 amps for street mode. I'll set 240 amps for our race mode. This does have a QS8 harness on here, so we can run a little bit more. I would recommend with the stock Talaria harness that you essentially run no more than 250 amps and keep an eye on the connector. The next thing we need to look at is our wheel diameter. So we will measure physically our wheel diameter with a tape measure. When measuring the wheel, basically you want to measure from the bottom of the tire to the top of the tire. I'm about 650 millimeters. This just needs to be close. So we're going to jump into our app. We'll type in 650 millimeters for our wheel diameter. Now we need our gear ratio. Okay, so currently on this bike, we have a 48 tooth rear sprocket on this one. So we can see on this chart here, we can see that our final gear ratio is 9.15 for this setup. So jumping into our app, we'll change this to 9.15. If your speedo is incorrect, I would only change your wheel diameter. So I would go down or up to get your speedo correct. So I'd use a GPS app on your phone to get it perfect. That's kind of where you would be. Moving down here, we've got our temperature unit. In Australia, we're going to use the metric system, so we'll use Celsius. If you're in America, obviously Fahrenheit is going to be the correct one. Same with speed, kilometers per hour, and miles per hour if you're in the States. Once we click save, the app is going to get us to calibrate the motor. We need to make sure that the bike is on a stand because the rear wheel will now move. It will say, do you want to calibrate the motor? Click yes. Usually a calibration will take 30 seconds to a minute and it should come up successfully calibrated. If you do have an issue, I would recommend turning off the bike, turning it back on and trying to run this calibration again. So we've clicked save on that. We'll say no change, we're all good to go. Our next move will then be our controller calibrations. So first thing we want to do is look at our twist throttle setup. So this will basically calibrate our throttle. If you have a Talaria, the throttle voltages are slightly different to a Suron. The factory default is a Suron based throttle. So we'll set this up now. Click setup, basically run through the setup wizard. It will tell us that the setup process will start in 5 seconds and then to leave the throttle released for an additional 5 seconds. It'll then say press throttle, twist the throttle gently and hold for 5 seconds. Our throttle is now calibrated. Our voltage range has come back as 0.79 volts as our minimum throttle, and our maximum throttle has come back as 420 volts. So now we've done that, click save. In this case, we're not going to use the thumb regen throttle, so we won't calibrate that, but you follow the same step of procedures to calibrate this thumb throttle. In this app, in this section of the app, you can see you've got your motor temp cutoff. So if you were worried about overheating the motor or you wanted to push more out of it, I would not recommend changing this, but you can change this here. Another one to look at here is your field weakening. So your field weakening will increase your top speed. On this motor, 70 to 80% is a good place to be. I would not recommend going above 80% because the heat that is induced into the motor is too great. So I'm going to change this to 75%. Click save. If you ever need to calibrate your encoder again, you can do that here. So coming out of here, next thing we're going to do is go to our throttle page. Like I said earlier, we're not going to use the thumb throttle here. So we're going to turn that thumb throttle off. On top of this, I like a little bit of drag on the throttle, so I normally like to have a little bit of off-throttle regen on. It also gives some battery back, so even if you don't like having kind of that braking force when you let off the throttle, having it at least a little bit on will give you better throttle response and generally kind of give you some battery back as well, so it's good to have that on. I don't like a lot of off-throttle regen, but some people might like a lot more, so a fair amount would be 40%, something that kind of is just noticeable would be 10%, and then it'd be not very noticeable at 5%. I'd recommend 10%. It's a little bit of drag, it feels very natural. It also gives you power back into the battery. So if you're worried about range and feel, 10% is a good place to be, and that's generally where I would set it. So I've set it to 10% here, click save. The other thing to look at too is your ramping time. So ramping time is how sensitive your accelerator is. So if you want the power to come on sooner and harder, basically lowering your ramping time is the place to be. 20 milliseconds is somewhere that I personally like to have it for where it sits well for me. As far as the throttle expo, this essentially changes the ramping curve, so the shape of the throttle curve. So 0.5 is somewhere I like to be with most of these bikes, and depending, if the bike is more powerful, I will kind of make these settings less aggressive, but in this case, I like it fairly aggressive because this bike is only 15 kilowatt. Click save on that one. The next one to do now is literally just check your wheel direction. So put the bike into mode 1, make sure it's on the stand. We can see here that the motor's spinning, but it's obviously the wrong direction. To fix that, we go into general. You'll see motor direction. This purely relates to the sensor direction, and it will affect the motor direction. So don't worry if your motor's running clockwise and you've selected clockwise and now it goes the right way. It's purely around the sensor direction. Once you click save, I would then check again. We can now see our motor's going the right direction. Now we're on to modes and levels. So if you select a 72 volt battery and a stock harness, this will pretty much be set where it needs to be. I'm happy with 10, 12 and 15 kilowatt. Just remember that when you set these values that the peak value could exceed this. So for a split second, if you set to 15 kilowatt, you might actually hit 17. If you do have a stock 60 volt MX4, your setting here, your maximum setting, as you can see here, would be pretty much 10.5. And for power modes 1, 2, and 3, I would set it as 5, 8, and 10.5. You will peak at 11, 11.5, possibly 12. But just keeping that setting a little bit lower allows the controller to clamp sooner and reduce that current flow before the battery actually cuts off on the BMS. As far as phase amps go on a stock battery, I would go 450, 500, and 550. Moving on, because this is a 72 volt bike, I will go back to mode 1 as 10 kilowatt, mode 2 as 12, and mode 3 as 15 kilowatt. You can push the 15 kilowatt up to 17 kilowatt or 18 if you want to. I recommend just to keep the motor heat down, 15 kilowatt would be enough. As far as your phase amps go, 450 is fine for mode 1. Mode 2, I would definitely set at 500. The MX4 motor is a low speed, high torque motor. So having the phase amps high, it makes it quite a twitchy bike, especially with like a larger sprocket, something like a 48. If you had a 42, you could increase this. So I'm normally happy around 700 phase on this motor. You can obviously run that higher if you have a smaller sprocket and then you get the torque back. Just be aware that as you increase phase amps, you generally increase motor heat. Same with your field weakening. As you increase field weakening, you will also increase motor heat. On top of this, moving down to modes and levels, we also have our reverse strength. This essentially just controls how much strength we have going reverse on the bike when reverse is selected. I personally like this 90%. I like it to feel almost like the original throttle. It is a little bit laggy on the top, so have a play with it, see where you like it if you do use reverse. Coming over, we also have our thumb regen strength. It's important to never set this below 10%, even if you have this throttle off. Generally, if you have an aftermarket battery, you will run this at 100%. If you have a 60 volt battery, you will run this at 35%. Otherwise, you'll trip the BMS. In this case, we don't have it on and we're not using it, so we're fine here. In your speed limit, you will want this maxed out. The max is 200 kilometers for this setting. Street is basically the same setup as race, it's just you can have lower levels and you can also change your speed limit. This is kind of useful for enduro riders. We've made it so you can hold down your lower button on your SW102 and change between these two modes, so you can have a really powerful setup that has a really, really small top speed, and it is quite useful for off-road, or if you have some legal requirements and you need a street mode and an off-road mode, this is where you would set your speed limit. Moving through the app, we have our peripherals set up. So this is where you want to turn on your brake sensors, your tilt sensor, or your stand sensor. Generally, I remove these from bikes. They do cause a lot of issues if you're off-roading, etc. So I do have these turned off, and I do have these removed in this bike. If you have this set up and you wanted to use the 12-volt power supply, this is where you would control it. You've got your coolant pump. If you did have some kind of water cooling or a water-cooled heatsink for the X9, you would obviously wire that from the internal part of the X9000 and then basically have that driven from the coolant pump output here. Now, lastly, if you have any faults, a good place to go is the diagnosis point in the app. This will basically show you what fault codes you have, or if you have any fault codes, if you have any issues with your throttle or regen, or you might have nicked a cable and there's a stray voltage on your regen throttle, for instance, and why you're having a fault, you will see that through here. So that's the app setup for a MX4 with a 60-volt stock battery and a aftermarket 72-volt battery. Thanks for watching.